class is now in session. I am Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing yet another Sharks player review. And today we have one of the most controversial figures on the San Jose Sharks, Erik Karlsson. I'm sure there are going to be some people out there who think I am underrating his performance this season, and I'm sure there are going to be some people out there, a lot of people out there in fact, who believe I am going to be vastly overrating his performance and contributions to the San Jose Sharks this season because just of the situations surrounding Erik Karlsson. His contract, how he arrived here to San Jose in the first place, is not something that is necessarily looked favorably on by most Sharks fans. But we must, before we get into how he plays this season, we must first take a look at his history for the San Jose Sharks, and it starts in the offseason of the 17-18 season. The Sharks were fresh off of a second-round defeat to the newly minted Vegas Golden Knights on their way to a Stanley Cup Finals finish and lost to the Washington Capitals, and it seemed clear that the Sharks, even though they were 2 years removed from a Stanley Cup Finals berth for themselves, where they lost to the Pittsburgh Penguins, that they probably weren't just good enough without some really good luck to actually be a very heavy favorite contender in the NHL. And so going into this 18-19 season, which could potentially be their best look ever with some of these expiring contracts, and it maybe would never get as good, or at least would not recently get as good as it would be in that 18-19 season because Pavelski's contract was expiring, Meyer and LeBank's entry-level deals were expiring, Donskoy's contract was expiring. The 19-20 season was not necessarily looking as positive as this last season for the 18-19. As such, Doug Wilson was looking to try and make some sort of splash in free agency, and who better than to pick up than John Tavares, a star player from the New York Islanders. He walked in free agency, and he really seemed to be the perfect piece for the Sharks to add to try and really be that competitive team heading into the 18-19 season. And the Sharks certainly tried. They got right up there near the end, but unfortunately, through no fault of their own, he ends up signing with the Toronto Maple Leafs because he was such a Maple Leafs fan when he was a kid. Wow, what a touching story. But because the San Jose Sharks spent so much time and effort trying to pick up John Tavares, they were kind of left scrambling when he ended up signing with Toronto instead. And so, since Doug Wilson did not want to just go into this 18-19 season pretty much the exact same way they went into the 17-18 season, because the result probably wouldn't be much different, the Sharks ended up getting a bit desperate and making a pretty bold move. And this one didn't come at zero price besides money like John Tavares would have. Instead, the Sharks actually had to make a trade to pull this off, and they picked up Erik Karlsson, who at the time was still viewed as one of, if not the best defenseman in the NHL. In fact, quite recently in the 2017 playoffs, he was sort of declared, and many people believed that he was not only the best defenseman in the NHL, but potentially a top 3 player in general in the entire world. That's how good he was in the playoffs that year. And so the Sharks picking him up for a pretty cheap price, at least what people thought at the time, was viewed as rather impressive. They gave up Tierney, who was a pretty decent third-line center. DeMello was a bottom-pairing guy. Balcers wasn't doing much in the AHL. Josh Norris, while a pretty decent prospect for the Sharks, didn't seem to have much more of a ceiling than a second-line center, though of course we know that's not necessarily the case here today. And the first-round pick that, seemingly based on the history of the San Jose Sharks over the past decade and a half, was likely to be in the 20s, and not the third overall it actually ended up being. So much so that Doug Wilson didn't even end up lottery protecting that one. And it seems since that trade actually occurred, basically every single first-round pick that has been traded since then has been lottery protected. You could definitely put some blame on Doug Wilson for that one, I would say. But generally, it was viewed as a very positive trade for the San Jose Sharks, but it was not as seamless a fit as John Tavares would have been. The Sharks were really missing that elite player to add into their forward group, but on the defensive side of things, they weren't really missing a player of Erik Karlsson's caliber because they already had a player of Erik Karlsson's caliber in Brent Burns. He basically filled the same exact role as Karlsson, and so some people tried the positive spin of saying, well, now the San Jose Sharks will have one of Burns or Karlsson on the ice at all times, but that's not necessarily that fantastic. Obviously, when you replace DeMello with Erik Karlsson, you're going to generally be better than you were in the previous year, just because Karlsson is that much better than DeMello, but it's not as massive of a rise of play as you would have gotten had you managed to sign John Tavares. But still, Karlsson, while it was a shaky start with the San Jose Sharks in that 18-19 year, he really ended up picking up and just having an absolutely fantastic end of the season. Unfortunately, Karlsson would get injured, and so going into the playoffs that year, while he would end up playing, it would not really be the same, and the Sharks would drop, of course, as we know, in the third round to the St. Louis Blues, who would eventually end up winning the Stanley Cup that season. I truly believed that that was the Sharks' best chance at the Stanley Cup over this past decade and a half, even better chance than they had when they even made it to the Stanley Cup Finals in 2016, because this 18-19 team was so good, but unfortunately they dealt with injuries, and Karlsson was sort of the number one on that list. Anyhow, because of how well that season did go when Karlsson was healthy, Doug Wilson doubled down on the bet he made when he acquired Karlsson in the offseason previous and signed him to an 8-year, $92 million deal, $11.5 million per year to the injury-prone Erik Karlsson. And that has not worked out even a bit since then. The 1920 and the 2021 seasons were not only bad seasons for Erik Karlsson, but they were exceptionally bad when you take into account that $11.5 million contract. He probably wasn't even worth half of that. He was just generally a net negative player for the San Jose Sharks through a couple of those seasons. Not necessarily saying that, if they had played Milosh over Karlsson, they would have been better and made the playoffs. Obviously not, but I'm saying that Karlsson did not have good years. This season, however, things did kind of take a change a bit for the better. When it comes to his stats, of course, 50 games played, 10 goals, 25 assists for 35 points. He certainly had a bit of a rebound offensively, as this would, over an 82-game season, be 57 points. The major problem, once again, for Erik Karlsson is he just can't stay healthy. He has yet to play a full season for the San Jose Sharks in the 4 years he has been there. You may be saying, well, what about last year? And that is technically true. He only missed 4 regular season games last year, but that was in a regular season that was already shortened because of the COVID situation to 56 games. He has yet to play more than 50-something games for the Sharks in his entire career, the 4 years he has been here, which has really been a major problem for himself, how injury-prone he has been. But in the 50 games that he did play, he actually wasn't all that bad. He generally was a positive impact player for the San Jose Sharks. While he was on the ice, the Sharks generated more shots than they gave up. The Sharks generated more scoring chances than they gave up. The Sharks generated even more high-danger scoring chances than they gave up with Karlsson on the ice, which is even more impressive because of the fact that the Sharks were generally still, once again, a bad team. So you would expect the Sharks as a whole to be giving up more chances than they actually get, because that is exactly the formula to becoming a bad team in the NHL. And yet with Karlsson on the ice, he was making a positive impact. And this is exactly how you have to evaluate a player like Erik Karlsson. You can't just look at his negatives and say, well, since he made a terrible play on this particular goal against, he's just a bad player. Karlsson is basically this type of give and take player. I have mentioned this many times in the past, where he has immensely high highs, but also some really low lows, and you have to evaluate whether the high highs are actually worth those low lows. In the past couple of seasons, it hasn't really been the case, but that scale has shifted this year, where I feel as though while this wasn't a perfect season for Erik Karlsson, he didn't absolutely dominate like he did in the 18-19 season. This was still his best season since that 18-19 performance, and I would say that Karlsson ends up getting the grade of a B-, and I felt as though that his ice time also ended up reflecting this, shot up actually a decent amount over these past couple of years, with the 23 minutes and 26 seconds that he got, only behind Brent Burns, unsurprisingly, for the lead for the San Jose Sharks. And while his -14 doesn't look particularly appetizing, you must also take into account that, first of all, since he plays so many minutes on this bad team, the minus is likely to be deflated because of that, but also, since the Sharks generally are trailing in many of the games that they do play, and Erik Karlsson always plays in 6-on-5 situations, and in 6-on-5 situations when the other team scores those empty net goals, they count as minuses, it's not necessarily that much of a surprise that he is going to be a -14. It's not necessarily a positive spin that I'm giving it, but I'm just trying to say that it's not all that bad. And when you take a look at the stats, he has been pretty good for the Sharks, and like I said, a B- ends up being okay for him. Class dismissed.